Thanks for having me. So I'm an Egyptologist, which means that I work on the ancient cultures of what is today Egypt. Although many Egyptologists also work on ancient cultures to the south of Egypt, so in what is today Sudan.
Hello and welcome to Obehi podcast. I'm your host, Obehi Ewafo, and I strongly believe that everyone has a story to share. Now let's get started into this episode.
So I think of these as ancient Nile Valley cultures because at that time, of course, the modern borders that we think of as Egypt and Sudan don't apply to those ancient cultures. So I work in the field of ancient Nile Valley studies. And I came to this field of study actually through an interest in Islamic studies and the modern country of Egypt, and in going to Egypt to learn how to speak Arabic a little bit better and to understand that culture. That was my introduction to the ancient world of the Nile Valley.
That's very interesting. So you are originally from Philadelphia. Can you say a few? I know that the time that we have is pretty limited, but it's okay. We still care about you, your story. In fact, if you read on that, everyone has a story to share. So despite the fact that we might pay attention to everything that you are going to say, but we care about you as a person. So tell me a little bit about yourself, where you were born and where you grew up. Tell me about that, please.
Sure. So I was born and grew up in the state of Pennsylvania, but not in the city of Philadelphia. I live in Philadelphia now, which is a great city. I grew up in a very, very small town, population about 3,000, in the north central part of Pennsylvania. And my heritage is that my father is from London. He was born and raised in England, and he came to the United States as a young man. He was transferred here for business reasons. And he met my mother in this country. My mother is of Lebanese heritage. So I suppose one would say like half English, half Lebanese, if we're talking in modern nation state language.
All right. Now, growing up in Philadelphia, no, you didn't grow up in Philadelphia. I don't know if I get that correct. But anyway, what I'm interested in is that growing up as a young woman in the U.S., what was the thing that you see around you in terms of, because I want to believe that there are something that made you want to choose history, to have curiosity in learning about history, which is what you are doing today. But I'm trying to understand how that even came about. Is it by accident or is it by intention? Was it because your parents made you to do that? So help me understand that you are still much younger now.
It's an interesting question. I think for me, I became interested in history probably because my father was interested in history and talked to me a lot about it when I was growing up. And his interest, his knowledge, of course, was strongest about English history, since that's where he was born and raised. And he taught me about, the ancient history of that island and, the more recent history. And he used to play a game with me. We had a big globe and he would spin it around and like stop it. And I would have to name the country and name the capital or maybe name some rivers in it. And so he got me very interested in geography and history. And I think that combined with the fact that my mother has Lebanese heritage and she was raised speaking Arabic, although she didn't teach us, her children, Arabic. So that made me really want to learn Arabic and made me want to understand Lebanese culture better. So I think all of those things combined made me interested in history.
Okay, now you got rooted so much in ancient history. Of course, this is also very important now, because if we want to know where we are going, we must know where we are coming from. So give me sort of what interests you about Egyptian history, the ancient Kemet history. What is the thing that actually interests you? Of course, Egypt, ancient Kemet are not the only ancient people in the world, but you decide to focus on this. There must be a reason for that. What is the reason?
The reason has a lot to do with the fact that I visited Egypt as a young person. So when I was studying Arabic in college, I was encouraged to go to a country where Arabic was the predominant language, so that I could be living and speaking Arabic every day. And I chose Egypt, so I did a study abroad course in Egypt. And living in Egypt, I mean, I came from this tiny small town, and I was living in Cairo, which is a huge city, and I fell in love with it. I fell in love with Egypt. I fell in love with Cairo. And that was my first introduction to the ancient history of that area. And I became fascinated with that as well. And so I was continuing my studies in Islamic studies and training myself in archaeology, which at that time you couldn't train in Egypt. When you were learning archaeology, you had to learn it elsewhere. And so I was doing archaeological training elsewhere, but I would always go back to Egypt and travel around and visit and sort of educate myself on those ancient cultures. So I would say that I came to be fascinated with the ancient history of the Nile Valley through repeated visits to the modern area, and meeting the people who live there, and just very much feeling in tune with that area.
All right. In terms of the preparation, what do you have to do? Okay, now, but this is general now. How do people need to prepare as an archaeologist? Because you say you didn't need to do this study in Egypt, but of course you need to go there from time to time. And so, in terms of this preparation, take me there a little bit. What do you have to do in preparing yourself?
Well, there's different ways to prepare oneself. A lot of people I know do reading and self-study. Of course, now there are all sorts of courses and lectures online that weren't available when I was a young person. If you literally want to get training in the field of archaeology, there are places in the US that you can do that. And that experience is very good and very important to just learn the skills that you need in the field. And that transfers well no matter where you go to dig after you gain those initial skills.
All right. Some of these skills will include what?
Well, there's knowing how to dig, for one thing, in a way that is not going to disturb the layers under where you're digging. So it's like you can't just sort of take a shovel and start digging dirt. You have to, there's special tools, you have to move carefully, you have to move at certain required levels. So like, let's say whatever your dig director has determined, we're going to go this far on this layer. You need to be sure you go that far and not that far. Drawing and mapping are an important part of archaeology. You typically will be taking photographs as well. There's observation, there's understanding what you're going to find on the dig. So before you go to the dig, you might be educated, say, in the ceramic tradition of the area where you're digging, so that when you find ceramics, you understand what it is you're looking at. Or you might look at stone structures of the culture that you're excavating, so that when you find rocks in a certain pattern, you understand what that stone structure may have been.
Mm-hmm. This kind of work, is it something that you are particularly interested in? Is it something that motivates you to work, since you have to do a lot of digging and all that? How passionate is it for you as a career, as a job?
So I enjoy archaeology, but I have not worked as an archaeologist for a long time. I did my early training in archaeology, and then I did later training in language and art. And now the work that I'm doing, that I'm very passionate about, is making connections between those ancient cultures and more modern scholars, so early 20th century scholars. So I work particularly on scholars of African descent in the US in the early 20th century, and how they were engaging with these ancient cultures and engaging with the academic disciplines that were studying those ancient cultures. So very early Egyptology. Egyptology is a fairly young discipline in the grand history of the university. So in the early 20th century, there were only a couple of Egyptologists in the United States at that time in universities. And so these scholars of African descent were engaging with those Egyptologists, they were engaging with Egyptologists elsewhere in the world, and they were really reading histories and understanding what we knew about those ancient cultures at that time.
Egyptologist, that is how you are described, right?
Yes.
What does it mean? Can you explain that, please?
Sure. So Egyptology is the ancient culture of the Nile Valley in what is today Egypt. So Kemet, of course, as you mentioned, is one of the ancient Egyptian words for that northern Nile Valley area. Egyptology today, it can involve archaeology, it can involve studying art, like the art in temples and tombs, for instance, or statues. It involves language. There are many different phases of the ancient language in Kemet, because that culture lasted for so long. And so language evolves over time. There are different language phases. There are different scripts that the language is written in, where most of us are familiar with hieroglyphs, and that's one way to write the ancient language, but there were others as well. So Egyptology can be archaeology, it can be art and art history, it can be history, it can be language study. All of those together make up the field of Egyptology, but typically Egyptologists will specialize in one or two of those areas.
Mm-hmm. All right. As an Egyptologist, what do you do? How does somebody describe your kind of work? How do you gather the information? How do you actually, in your day-to-day work, take us through that? Because many of us do not even understand how that works.
Sure. So some Egyptologists will have to go to Egypt to do their work. So for instance, if you're an archaeologist, you have to have a site that you're excavating. And so you go there and you do the work on the site. People who are focusing more on art history or history may go to museums to look at, for instance, the art in a museum collection and do their research in that way. They may look at ancient texts, books in a library, for instance. There are quite a lot of texts in museum collections as well. So that's another way to study ancient texts.
Mm-hmm. All right. Now, a curiosity, a very strange feeling that I was having. Though, what does the discipline need to exist at all? Egyptology. What is the essence of its existence?
That's a good question. So this is important for those of us who want to understand human heritage. We look at ancient human cultures to understand how those ancient cultures were organized, how people lived. And this is important all over the world, not just in Egypt, to understand human origins. So Egyptology is one of many disciplines that looks at ancient humans, and it's important for us as humans to have these fields so that we understand our human trajectory across time. So I should mention there's a sort of allied discipline to Egyptology, which is called Nubiology. And it has very much the same sort of sub-disciplines as Egyptology. So archaeology, art history, language. But this focuses on the southern Nile Valley. So today, what is southern Egypt and Sudan. And so Egyptology and Nubiology together are very powerful, because then you're looking at the Nile Valley as a whole, and more Egyptologists and Nubiologists are in conversation with one another and are sharing information. There's a lot more work being done in Nubiology today than there was 50 years ago. So this is very exciting, because we're not getting just a snapshot picture of what was happening in the northern Nile Valley. We're getting a fuller picture of what was happening along the Nile Valley. And then, and this is even, I would say, a newer phenomenon, we're getting some scholars who are able to make connections between these ancient cultures of the Nile Valley and other cultures in Africa. And this is an area that is that has been very understudied until recently. And so I'll just give you a couple names of people who are doing this work right now. My colleagues Salim Faraji and Anissa Malvoisin. There are also some linguists who are doing work sort of connecting languages within the Nile Valley and elsewhere in Africa. And those are people like Andrew Jaggs and Sandro Capocicci and Chris Arrett. And there's work being done by biological anthropologists who are looking at ancient human remains from various places in Africa and making connections. And so a big person who does that work is Professor Keita, S-O-Y Keita, Kamani Nahusi, and also, I know on your podcast you spoke with Taharka Ade, who he's sort of making connections between Africa and African American culture in the US. So there's a lot of work being done outside of the discipline of Egyptology that's connecting with Egyptology. And this is where I think the field is going in the future. This is what is critically important, is to sort of break down these disciplinary boundaries that the university has set up and to have these conversations to show the interconnectedness of ancient humans in Africa, and then to show cultural connections in the modern day within Africa and in the diaspora as well.
That's very interesting. All right. Now, the study of Egypt or ancient Kemet, as we understand it, and the study of Nubia, are we actually looking at two different things here? So that we have Egyptologists and Nubiologists. I'm trying to understand what is actually the difference between the two.
The main difference is that Egyptologists work in the northern Nile Valley and Nubiologists work in the southern Nile Valley. So for those who aren't familiar with the word Nubia, Nubia refers to the area that is today southern Egypt and probably about the northern half of Sudan along the Nile Valley. So Nubiologists refer to people who study Nubia. So yeah, it's basically just a matter of geography. That's the key difference there.
Which, if by extension, if we were to actually put a ruler there, they are just neighbors, no?
Yes, that's right.
So which by extension can actually mean we are talking about the same culture. Is it possible?
Well, let's say the same groups of cultures, because it's such a very large geographic area. I wouldn't say there was one culture along that whole area. There's so many different settlements. And we're talking about such a long period of time for these ancient cultures that they existed. I mean, thousands of years. So I would say it's many cultures across a large geographic area, across a huge time span, but all in this Nile Valley. And so all sort of connected in that way, both literally by river travel, but also just in having contact, sharing a geographic zone with one another.
I'm trying to think now. Somebody will say is study the Romans, no? At least it can go as far as the whole of the Roman world, no? You can be talking about, because Roman also extend to UK, they extend to part of the Middle East, and is it Germany you want to be? It's at the end of the day, you are probably going to be talking about the same, if you are looking at Roma as a people, as a group of people, because they live for several years done together, so they manage to form their own culture, their own writing, their own way of life. It doesn't necessarily mean that you are referring to Rome or Italy, no? Is it possible that in that sense we can be looking at a group of people where we are looking at Egypt, Nubia, the geography that we are looking at here, we can actually be looking at a people that have been mixing up among themselves? Is it possible like that, or is it that Egypt is completely different from Nubia? That is what I want you to clarify.
I would not say that Egypt is completely different from Nubia. There are differences, of course, but there are similarities, and it's very clear that those ancient cultures had contact with one another, that people from Nubia were living in Egypt and vice versa. People from Egypt were living in Nubia, and they were sharing cultural traditions in the way that people do when they come into contact with one another. They were certainly intermarrying with one another. And I should say also that this, in my opinion, this likely extended further south and also further to the west. But we have less evidence from those areas, so it's very difficult for us to sort of pinpoint this and to point to evidence. We don't have that evidence because these areas are understudied with regard to antiquity. But it makes sense to me that these cultural connections, these connections between people, would have continued further south in Africa, further to the west in Africa. And we get hints of this, I should say, in Egyptian texts. So we do know that the Egyptians traveled south, like one of the lands they mention, which is far, far further south than Nubia, and perhaps maybe on the East Coast. We're not exactly sure where this land was, but it was called the land of Punt. And we know that the Egyptians would mount expeditions and go to Punt and trade with the people there and bring back goods from that area. We know that Egyptian officials traveled to places that seem to be to the south and west of Egypt. And we're not sure exactly what these places are. Like we haven't been able to correlate the ancient geographic name with a modern place name, but we can tell just from the text and the way they talk about it that it does seem to be south into the west. So here I'm thinking of a particular official named Harkuf. So we get hints that these connections were happening further afield than only between Egypt and Nubia, but we don't have as much hard evidence as we would like, other than these ancient texts that talk about it, but they don't give us obviously modern place names to help us understand exactly where they're talking about.
And that is very interesting. And of course, they're not going to make mention of Nigeria or Ghana because these are a modern name, no?
Right.
Another thing that is actually very interesting is it possible that those that are study the ancient Kemet or Egypt, this case, because that is how the West prefer to call it, just decide to look for evidence to support a particular claim and leave every other thing out of it? Is it possible like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think for sure that's one explanation. I think there are multiple explanations. Part of it is that excavating in the Sahara Desert, it's a very forbidding environment. So it's quite difficult to do archaeology in that area. But we know that in ancient times, so now I'm talking like pre-Kemet, in very, very ancient times, the Sahara was not a desert. And this what I'm about to talk about now is what's called the Green Sahara. So what is now the Sahara Desert, what had been a fertile area. And we know that people migrated across that area. And people who study petroglyphs, which are ancient drawings on rocks, those rock drawings were made by these ancient people who were traveling across this Green Sahara. And so we know that there were connections between populations in the northern and more central areas of Africa, because this wasn't a forbidding environment. There was no barrier of a desert like there is today. So there were for sure connections, not just along the Nile Valley, but elsewhere in Africa, in this northern and central area of Africa. But yeah, I mean, part of it is like lack of interest in looking at it, but part of it is difficulty in finding the evidence because of the forbidding landscape today. But that doesn't mean that no one's doing the work. People are. So I'll just throw out a couple of names. David Wengrow is one person who works on this Green Sahara time period and works on ancient migrations. Stuart Tyson Smith also does this sort of work. And there are many others, many other scientists, so people outside of the field of Egyptology, scientists who work on like ancient climate, for instance, ancient geographical systems, climate systems. These sorts of people are much more familiar with Green Sahara from a climatological standpoint. And they write about it in that respect. And then Egyptologists, anthropologists, and others can come along and layer what we know about human migration and discuss the migratory patterns that we think people were using, that we see people using. One of the things I just learned about just last week, my colleague Solange Ashby, who she sort of straddles the fields of Egyptology and Nubiology. She's a little bit of both. Solange was just telling me last week about something I had never heard of, which is called Mega Lake Chad. And so Lake Chad, which exists today, in ancient times was much huger than it is today. It was a huge freshwater sea, larger, they say, than the Caspian Sea is today. And so I started looking at this after she told me about it. And there's satellite imagery from NASA where you can see, sort of Lake Chad today, which is this big, and the boundaries of Mega Lake Chad. And the banks of it are still visible in satellite imagery that NASA has posted. So that's another example of how easy it would have been for ancient humans to migrate across this area that we think of as not being easy to traverse today, because you would have had watering spots like this that would have facilitated movement.
Mm-hmm. But also, in the study of ancient antiquity, is it possible that we can also look at language as if it were a map to sort of help us understand where people are coming from and where they are going to? Because I think the notion that ancient Egyptians just suddenly became Egyptian, it doesn't really explain where they are coming from. Maybe if we go deeper, we can see that they're actually not coming from Egypt, but they are coming from other part of Africa. Because at the end of the day now, there is only, scientifically speaking, there is only one group of human species that exists today, which is the human being that we have today. And all of us came from one source. So is it possible that we can trace the language to find something about that?
I think that's possible. I'm not one of those people who works on language in that way, so my knowledge of it is very limited. But there are people who do work on that. So I mentioned Andrew Jaggs and Chris Arrett and Sandro Capochici. They all work on ancient language systems in Africa. And they are able to make those connections to understand where languages come from in terms of geography, where they're moving to, the words that are borrowed from language to language. So what you've described it is possible to do that, and people are doing that. I'm just not one of those people.
Okay. Actually, where I wanted to go there is the fact that there is a debate whether Egypt is actually Africa, no? Because if you are in the US, no, you are a US citizen, you understand what I mean. That in the US you have African study, then you have Egyptian study, which make you believe that as if when you are talking of Egypt, you are talking of a different people other than Africa. So then it become a little bit confusing for me. When you as an Egyptologist, are you talking about African history, or are you talking about people other than Africa? So I'm not yet clear on that.
Yeah, what you've described is a big problem in the way that people in the US and elsewhere in Europe talk about and think about these cultures. When I talk about Egypt, when I talk about ancient Egypt, I'm talking about Africa. But you are absolutely correct that there are some people and some institutions as well, like museums, for instance, or universities. There are some places where you will find that separation that you just described, where people will speak of Egypt in ways that separate it from Africa. And there are many reasons for that. I'll try to sort of summarize them quickly. But it has a lot to do with Western colonialism, Western imperialism, and sort of a claiming of the space of Egypt by Western powers first physically, of course, as it was a colony, but also intellectually, where Western scholars of 150 years ago, let's say, were claiming that space of ancient Egypt as part of a Western heritage. And so they made it not African in a sense. That's how they spoke of it. That's how they wrote about it. And that's how it sort of came to be understood by the public. And that's obviously not correct. I mean, it's very clear, you look at a map, that Egypt is in Africa, but it's also very clear when you look at ancient evidence that the cultures of the Northern Nile Valley were very much African in their cultural heritage. And we see that with all the cultural similarities between the Northern Nile Valley and elsewhere in Africa. I mean, in the United States, there was, in the 19th century and the early 20th century, there were very incorrect views that Africa had no history. And African Americans in the United States who were fighting this narrative would point to the ancient cultures of Egypt as proof. Like, yes, there's obviously a history to Africa. Look at everything that exists in Egypt. And at that time, not a whole lot was known, comparatively speaking, about ancient Sudan. And so typically they were pointing to Egypt, but on occasion, these scholars would point to Sudan as well. And now we know so much more about the ancient cultures of Sudan. And so we're able to point more fully to those cultures. And we're beginning to know more about ancient cultures elsewhere in Africa. So we can continue to build this narrative out. And it's important that we do that. And all of that together can help change this idea that Egypt is somehow not of Africa. It most definitely is part of ancient African history.
All right. Now, this is a line of thoughts that have been sold into the mind of people for several centuries. Of course, it's not only about Egypt, not be Africa, and also for the fact that Africa don't even have a history. It's just like you have a people that have been existing for several millennia, and they don't have a history of existence. Like they just came from the sky, I don't know, or from the ground, or they germinated from the tree. Even if you germinate from the tree, there is a history of you from being a flower to a fruit to becoming a seed, dying and germinating. Even plants have history. Even trees, even flowers, those are history. Do you think, historically speaking, since you deal with history, there is any significance, any consequences of this fabrication to the mind, to the behavior of the people? Do you think it have any importance, or it doesn't make any difference?
Oh, I think it's critically important. I think the way that we understand history of an area and of people, it definitely affects our modern conceptions of those people because it shapes our language and the way we talk about people, the way we think about people. So it's absolutely critical. And picking up on your point that, even a flower has history, even a tree has history, I totally agree with you. And part of this problem of the old narrative of, Africa had no history, part of that problem was a sort of hierarchical view of history that existed at that time. So I'm talking 150 years ago, 100 years ago, where historians felt that there was only value to a history that involved written records and a history that involved urban populations. And we have very much moved away from that view. We now, I would say most people would no longer accept that view anymore. They do see the importance in cultures that have no written records, in cultures that are living non-urban lifestyles. But that kind of hierarchy to history was part of the problem, where people weren't saying what you just said, oh, even a flower has history, right? Every population group has history. Every human being has history, partakes in human history. And that is critically important that we continue to stress that, because to say the opposite is completely dehumanizing, right? If you look at a particular population group and you say, oh, they don't have written records, they don't really share in human history, you have just dehumanized them and made them something other than human. And that's completely unacceptable.
What I want to ask you, no, okay, I'm not really going to drag that line any further than that, because if at the time they were talking about the fact that Africa have no history, maybe because they didn't know that there was a 12th century Maya empire bigger than the whole of Western Europe. So that didn't make any sense. They didn't know of ancient Zimbabwe. Okay, that didn't make any sense. They didn't know of the manuscript of Timbuktu. Those are written texts. So I want to go back again to what I was saying before. The idea that in Egypt, maybe we just tell the people, do this particular study. This is the one that you are going to look for. Dig this part. If you find this part, this is something. But if you find anything other than this, don't regard it. Is it possible that we could actually be doing this artificial selection of history in order to justify a certain claim? Is it possible like this?
It's possible. The problem is that all of these systems sort of hang on to one another. So let's say that I am a scholar who I need funding to fund my research, right? So I apply for funding, but if my research project isn't interesting to the funders, then I won't get funding and I can't do my research, right? So I have to come up with a project that is interesting to whoever I'm trying to get funding for. And once I get that funding, then maybe I can go do that research and then I need to publish it. But if my research isn't interesting to any of the research journals that I want to publish in, then they won't publish it, right? It'll get rejected by the peer reviewers, or, just turned away before it even gets to peer review, whatever. So all of these systems hang on one another. The funders may have no relation to the people who publish my research, but all of those things have to line up for me to do research and get it published. So I think what you're suggesting about artificially selecting research projects, it happens, and it's not necessarily with any sort of ill will or bad intention. It's just that researchers need a lot of things to fall into place from a lot of different systems in order to do their research, write it up, get it published.
That is very interesting. All right, when you were saying that, I was thinking, say maybe, for example, the Nigerian government was powerful enough to organize an expedition to Egypt to do a research about the origin of Egypt. Do you think they will get the same result that American expedition will get if American government send experts to study Egypt?
Well, it's an interesting question you ask. The thing is that every person, even if they're not from different parts of the world, even if they're from the very same part of the world, every person brings their own interpretation to the evidence that they're looking at. So let's pretend that I have a twin sister, which I don't, and we were raised together and we're on this archaeological dig together, and we find a pot. I might interpret that pot based on the evidence I'm seeing as, having one particular function, and she may interpret it a different way, looking at the same pot, but maybe pulling on some different evidence than I'm pulling on, and she may come up with a different interpretation. And that's people coming from the same culture. So you talk about two teams from two very different parts of the world coming and doing work in Egypt. I think it's quite likely that different interpretations would be brought to the evidence by the two teams because they're coming from different backgrounds and they're coming from different educational systems, and maybe they're asking different questions of the evidence as well. So let's say our evidence is this pot that I've just found. You know, I might want to know, what was this pot used for? You might want to know, who were the people using this pot? So we might even ask different questions of the evidence itself. And this is part of the exciting thing about being a researcher, is that it's not a simple sort of open and shut case. It's not like, okay, here's a pot, this is what it was used for, here's who used it, end of story. The story, in a sense, is never over, because we're constantly thinking about the evidence in new ways. So for instance, let's just say climate change, for instance. This was something that researchers 30 years ago weren't thinking about when they did their research. But today, it's very difficult to think about these ancient climatescapes without thinking about climate change, whether it's climate change in antiquity or climate change today. So that's an example of new questions that are being brought to bear on evidence.
A couple of months ago, I was interviewing a British writer. At the point, it had to do with history. I like this argument on ancient history because it is very important. It helps us to understand even what is happening today. Say maybe in the United States, you know, many people, they think that when we are looking at the United States, maybe the treatment of African America and the white America, it just start and end in the United States. I usually say, no, it doesn't start and end there. We need to go beyond these people. Who are these African Americans and who are these white America? Where are they coming from? Then at the point we get to understand that these are even neighbors. Before there was the United States, there was Africa, and there was Europe. They are neighbors. So we should be able to take it there and even further than that to understand where we are coming from. So in this sense, history is very important. So the digging up of history also is very costly and very and require a lot of work. For this, even by mere rational thinking, it is going to be impossible for a line that was established for you to go against. By that I mean, if Washington is sponsoring an expedition to Africa to study African history, Africans should count themselves out that they are going to be represented in that story. It is not possible because they are not the one footing the bill. It is hard to do. It is not just, I'm going there to tell the history of the world. No, there are sentiments, there are feelings, there are questions that are very pertinent to more important things than just writing. It is not, because like you also said, somebody is going to approve it. Approve it based on what? So if Abuja, which is the Nigerian government, were the ones spearheading an expedition, the verification, the parameter they are going to use to evaluate what they found is going to be different from what Washington is going to need. Because what Nigeria is going to ask for is not what Washington is going to ask for. For this same reason, I think Africans need to be the one that is digging up their own story. They need to tell their story. They need to pay the cost for it. They need to interpret it according to their sense and sensibility. Now, going back to this again, because you work on this a lot, of course, before the interview, we have exchanged few lines on that. Can you share anything with me in terms of your reference about this Egyptology study, what you find, how you gather your evidence? Because now I want to state what is already obvious, that by talking about Egypt, we are talking about Africa. Normally, Africans should have been the expert in this story. But do we have them there? Because most of Egyptologists are not actually Africans.
Well, there are a lot of Egyptians who are Egyptologists. So Africa is well represented in terms of Egyptian Egyptologists. There are also many Sudanese people who are Nubiologists and also Egyptologists. So let's say the Nile Valley part of Africa is represented in the disciplines of Egyptology and Nubiology. Elsewhere in Africa, there are fewer Egyptologists and Nubiologists represented. I wouldn't say there aren't any, but fewer, at least to my knowledge. I have only met, I would say, less than 10 people. And maybe there are more, and I just haven't had the opportunity to meet them. That's quite possible, because I know there are university programs in Africa that treat these Nile Valley cultures. I haven't been to any of those universities, so I haven't met any of those people. But I'll give you a couple of names. I mean, Theophile Benga is one person who spent much of his career in the United States teaching, and is now back in Africa. And he, to my knowledge, has started a program in ancient Nile Valley cultures. One very famous person who is no longer with us is Sheikh Anta Diop, of course. So there's a strong tradition of this. And there are certain people I know. Yoporeka Somet is one person who I've never met in person, but I've exchanged some emails with him, who is not from the Nile Valley, but is working on these ancient cultures. And so there may be so many more others that I don't know and would love to meet, because I would love to hear about their work.
Actually, that is very important. Yeah, of course, there are many African scholars out there in this area. I'm only looking at the percentage compared to what we often read about as Egyptologists, as expert of Egyptian history. In most of the cases, even in documentary, are usually the Europeans. Maybe this is part of the fact that, okay, there is a project, they need to be approved, they need to, okay, it's evidence now, we can go out there and we can just see them. Okay, now let's say in your field of study, because this is your field of study, when you go out to present a case from your finding, what kind of exchange do you easily meet? Is it a kind of resistance on the part of the African people? Is it an accept? Tell me about your feeling with the people. What do you usually experience when you go to talk about Egyptian history, and maybe the audience are Africans, things like that?
So I haven't had the opportunity to speak in Africa about my research. I've done a lot of speaking in the US. And so I can talk to you about the reception to my work in the US, if you like. So the last, I don't know, 7 or 8 years, I've been working on this project that I mentioned to you, where I'm looking at scholars of African descent in the US in the early 20th century and conversations they were having with Egyptologists or about Egyptology in general. And the reception I've gotten in the US is very positive, because no one knew about these conversations before I started doing, well, let's say very few people knew about these conversations when I started doing this research. So Egyptologists for sure had no idea. This was not part of the history of the discipline that we learn. So Egyptologists are very excited. They had no idea that, for instance, Flinders Petrie, who's a very famous British archaeologist, was writing letters with W.E.B. Du Bois, or that Marcus and Amy Jakes Garvey were writing editorials that were talking about the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb, or were criticizing the professor of Egyptology at Harvard. Nobody knew that Booker T. Washington was exchanging letters with a professor of Egyptology at the University of Chicago. Pauline Hopkins, who is a woman who's an African-American novelist and editor. Nobody knew that she wrote a novel set in the Nile Valley and used all of these history books to construct the conversations that the archaeologists had about the work that they were doing there. So there's some really exciting stuff that I found. And Egyptologists are excited about it, and members of the public, when I give talks, are very excited about it, because this is new information. These are connections between these university professors, between the history books that they wrote, and African descended communities in the US.
That's very interesting. All right, now as an Egyptologist, when you get to your site, okay, I know this might be depending on what kind of project you are working on, but actually I'm interested in, what are you actually looking for? I mean, when you go to dig, What are you looking for? What tells you that this is a valid thing and the other is not a valid thing, for example?
So let me begin by saying I've never excavated in Egypt. So like I was saying early in our talk, when I was young, when I was doing my archaeological training, you couldn't do that training in Egypt. So I actually did my training elsewhere, both in the United States and in Jordan. So what I'm going to tell you is not based on my experience excavating in Egypt, since I've never done that. But archaeologically speaking, everything you find is of value. The hardest thing I would say when you're excavating, and this doesn't hold true in Egypt just because the terrain is very different there, but where I was excavating, you come across a lot of rocks. And the importance is understanding, is this a rock that just happens to be here, or is this a rock that is part of a bigger structure? And if I sort of take this rock and toss it over my shoulder and throw it away, am I dismantling a structure? Or is this just a rock that doesn't matter and I can toss it away and be done with it? So that's kind of a simplistic example of the choices you have to make when you're excavating.
All right, thank you for that. Now, on the expedition relating to the cemetery there that you went on in Egypt, can you share anything with us? What you find, things like that?
Yeah, so you're talking about the book that came out, the Phoebe A. Hurst expedition to Nubia. Yeah. So that book, which is available for free online, if anyone would like to download it, that is not archaeology work that I carried out. So those excavations, it was 2 cemeteries that we published. And those excavations actually happened between 1903 and 1905 by an American archaeologist and Egyptologist. And what happened was he did those excavations, he directed them in Egypt, and sent back to the United States the finds that he could send back. Many of the finds stayed in Egypt. But at that time, his work was being funded by a woman who was a wealthy woman based in California. Her name was Phoebe Hurst. And she wanted to start a museum in Northern California that would have examples of ancient cultures from all over the world. And so he was sort of the person supplying her with artifacts from the Nile Valley, but she funded archaeological expeditions elsewhere in the world that other people directed. So from these excavations he did between 1903 and 1905, he sent back some of the artifacts so that she could put them in her museum. And this museum now exists today. It's called the Hurst Museum, and it is on the campus of the University of California at Berkeley. So when I was living out there, about 7 or 8 years ago, I started this research project to publish these artifacts because he excavated them and then they never were published. And so I put together this whole team. It was a great group of people. There were about 12 or 13 of us in total from all over the world. So there were some students who were undergraduates at the University of California, Berkeley, some graduate students there. There were researchers from different places in the US. I brought in a world famous bead expert, my friend Yolanda Bos, who lives in the Netherlands. She is an expert on Egyptian beads. And there were a lot of beads from these 2 cemeteries. So I brought her to Berkeley to teach me what she knows about beads and to look at some of these artifacts with me. We spent a week together. And I learned everything I could from her, and she gave me all sorts of advice about the project, and we co-wrote the chapter on beads together. It was wonderful to work with her. So each person on my research team took a different subset of these artifacts, right? One person was working on the ceramic pots. One person was working on alabaster, little stone jars. So we each had different object groups that we worked on. Each person wrote a chapter. We put them together into this book. And so now there is a publication of these artifacts that had been excavated over 100 years ago and just had never gotten the chance to be published.
That's beautiful. And of course, you did make mention of the fact that it's available on Amazon, right? Am I correct on that?
It's not on Amazon. It is the publisher is Brill. It's a publisher based in the Netherlands, and it's available on their website for free. It's open access, so anyone can download the entire book.
There's something I was going through just now. Let me try to see if I can get a copy of it to read for you. Maybe about you, or maybe you have written in. I'm writing a book on conversation between white Egyptologists who held university position in the US and Europe, and scholars of African descent in the US, so that the voices of black scholars will become integrated into Egyptology's disciplinary history. Uh, can you say anything about that?
Yes. So this is the project I mentioned that I've been working on for 6 or 7 or 8 years now. What happened was I was teaching in California, and I came across an editorial that Marcus Garvey wrote, where he was criticizing the professor of Egyptology at Harvard. And this editorial was from the early 1920s. And I was so surprised because I knew who Marcus Garvey was. I had no idea that he knew anything about what a professor at Harvard was saying about ancient Egyptians. And I found this fascinating. And I talked to my students about it in class one day, and they were so excited about this information and so interested. And they kept, asking me questions, and we're talking about all this, and class is over, and they wouldn't leave the room because they were so excited. And the next class was trying to come in. And I was like, oh, this is great. Like, this is really good material. This makes the study of these ancient cultures relevant to people today. I mean, here's Marcus Garvey making it relevant for his readers in the 1920s. And here are my students in a classroom still seeing that relevance. So I thought, I need to do some more research on this. I need to find out what else was going on at that time. And I just sort of picked a name out of air. I was like, okay, Du Bois. He was a prominent African-American intellectual at that time. I wonder if he knew anything about Egyptology. And I started doing some research, and sure enough, I find out that Du Bois was exchanging letters around 1912 with a British archaeologist named Flinders Petrie. And this sort of blew my mind because I didn't know this. No Egyptologists I knew this. There are books written about Du Bois. There are books written about Flinders Petrie. Neither of them are really mentioning this. And yet this snippet of history, these letters that they exchanged, that's huge for Egyptology. And so I started to dig into that story and understand their relationship, and sort of built it out a little. And I published an article on that. I've published an article on the Marcus Garvey editorial, and then in doing that research, I learned that his wife, Amy Jakes Garvey, also wrote an editorial that talks about the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb, which was happening right at that time in the early 1920s. So I have an article on both of their engagements with Egyptology. Pauline Hopkins, who I mentioned, the editor and writer who wrote this fabulous book. And the story in the book involves an archaeological expedition going to Sudan. And they're talking about the archaeology of the ancient Nile Valley. And then there's sort of a twist in the story where it becomes almost like the Black Panther movie, where the main character finds this hidden city in Sudan that is peopled. The residents of it are descendants of the ancient people of Meroe. And they're this, wonderfully advanced culture, and they teach him about their culture, and they talk about his culture. He's from Boston, so they talk about life in the US. And Pauline Hopkins, I mean, it's a novel that she wrote, but she was pulling on all these history books, all these Egyptology books, to construct this story and to write the dialogue that her characters had with one another. So she was building history into her novel. And I know that she was doing that intentionally because a different book that she wrote talks about the importance of teaching history and how all these sort of pedagogical techniques for teaching history and how you can teach it through literature. So she absolutely was intentionally teaching history through this novel. So I have an article out about her. And right now, the one I'm working on is an article about Booker T. Washington, who I didn't know this, but had a close relationship with the president of the University of Chicago. University of Chicago is where I got my PhD. So the president of the University of Chicago in the early 20th century was a man named William Rainey Harper. And he and Booker T. Washington had a close professional relationship. And William Rainey Harper would invite Booker T. Washington to campus to give talks. He invited him to give a talk in Chicago to the public to celebrate the end of the Spanish-American War. And during that time in the early 20th century, Booker T. Washington exchanged letters with the Egyptologist at the University of Chicago, a man named James Henry Breasted. And so that's another facet of the history of Egyptology that Egyptologists aren't taught because nobody knew about it. This sort of had been lost to history. So I'm trying to flesh out all of these conversations, all of these letters that were exchanged, the writings that scholars of African descent in the US were doing about these ancient Nile Valley cultures to show the importance of these cultures to African American history and to show the engagement of those Black intellectuals with Nile Valley cultures. So all of these things that I'm writing, most of them are free. You can download them from my website, which is on academia.edu. Most of those articles are accessible there.
That's very interesting. It will be interesting to have a look at them. All right, now looking at maybe when you started to read about Egypt, about ancient Kemet, about Africa in this case, no? Did you happen to read maybe some books that were written by Africans on the topic? Can you share any of them with us that maybe sort of that you find interesting to help you understand it? Just let us know how some of those information you get there.
Yeah. So like I mentioned, one of the very big scholars from the mid to late 20th century in Africa who were writing about ancient Nile Valley cultures was Sheikh Anta Diop. And Sheikh Anta Diop and Theophile Benga, who I mentioned earlier, together went to and represented a perspective at a conference that involved a lot of other Egyptologists as well in the 1970s. And this conference was sponsored by UNESCO. And there was a publication that was a result of this conference, and it's available for free on UNESCO's website. It's a whole series of books. I believe it's called The General History of Africa by UNESCO. And there's a volume on ancient Africa. And so in that volume is writings from this conference that I mentioned. And Sheikh Anta Diop and Theophile Benga are represented there, as are other Egyptologists. And the person who edited the volume, who sort of convened that whole conference, was an Egyptian Egyptologist by the name of Gamal Mukhtar, who had been the head of the Antiquities Service in Egypt. So you have Sheikh Anta Diop, you have Theophile Benga, you have Gamal Mukhtar, all of whom are Africans working on ancient Nile Valley. So that volume is for free online. Like I mentioned, there are a lot of Egyptian and Sudanese scholars who work in Egyptology and Nubiology. One who I'll mention is Fekri Hassan, an Egyptian Egyptologist who writes a lot about ancient Africa, and again, about connections within Africa, and about the Nile Valley's place in Africa, so as an African entity and connections among ancient populations. So those are all good names to go and look at, I think.
Mm-hmm. Now, as an Egyptologist, looking at maybe the work of Sheikh Anta Diop on the conference of 1970, for example, which have become very popular among African, of course, among many scholars who are trying to understand the history of Egypt, and by extension the history also of Africa. What is your take on his line I mean, what is your take on his take on the story?
Well, he published a lot, so he had a lot of takes, and a lot of what he said I very much agree with. There, like there's a few things here and there that I guess I would say I don't agree with, but that's where the state of the field was at that time. There's a lot of things I don't agree with that a lot of Egyptologists say, right? Because this is the point. We're all learning as we're researching, right? And so a theory that's floated out at one time may seem to be correct, and then with more evidence or different interpretations, it's shown to be not correct. And it's not a big deal, or let's say it shouldn't be a big deal, because we're all in this together, right? We're all trying to understand these ancient cultures. So if I say I don't necessarily agree with everything he said, it's not a slam on him. It's that, additional evidence has come to light since the time that he wrote, or new interpretations have been applied on evidence. And again, like I would never dismiss a scholar outright, just because I disagreed with something that they said. Like I mentioned, there's a lot of scholars who I might disagree with a point here or a point there, but that doesn't mean that they're bad scholars or I disagree with anything they say. This is why these fields are so important, that we continue to staff them with researchers, because we are continually learning, we're continually re-understanding or understanding new aspects of things that we hadn't considered before. So it constantly changing, and very important that it do so, because we don't want to get sort of stuck in one old line of thinking.
All right. If I were to say maybe one or two things that you didn't agree particularly from Cheikh Anta Diop, what would that be?
So I mentioned earlier that I am not a specialist in ancient languages. But I know from people who are specialists in ancient languages that some of the connections he was making between language groups are no longer considered to be accurate by specialists in ancient languages. So I am following the lead of people who are experts in the area of language studies, and I believe what they say, since it's their field of research. I rely on their work.
All right. Okay. We'll leave it there. I'm not going to, for the sake of time too, but we could actually take it further than that. So I want to thank you so much. Now, for people that want to find out more about what you do, your books and also to connect with you. So use this moment to connect with people. Tell them how to find you.
So you can find me on the website academia.edu, where a lot of scholars have pages and upload their research. I have a page there, and everything that I'm able to provide freely there for people, I provide. Some journals won't let you post your information, your journal article, but everything that I can post there, I do. And so you can download it for free. I also am a scholar working with the Nile Valley Collective, and you can find us at nilevalleycollective.com. We are an international group of scholars who work to discuss the ancient Nile Valley cultures in their African contexts.
For somebody who wants to understand more about Egypt, about ancient Kemet, about Africa, say maybe, for example, looking at the Nile Valley, what would you recommend? Maybe books, or I don't know, maybe courses, a way that this person can have a kind of a broad view of that history?
I think that the UNESCO volume that we talked about is a very good place to start, because it is a general history of Africa. It's understanding those cultures in an African context. And then I would say the subsequent volumes in that same series, because as you mentioned, there are so many other ancient cultures in Africa that in the US, and I suspect in many other parts of the world, we're just not hearing enough about in our history classes.
All right. Would you want to add anything to the conversation to conclude it? Because we really have touched different angles. It can be a message, whatever you want to add to conclude it.
Well, I want to thank you for the invitation to come and talk with you. I've listened to many of your other podcast interviews, and I really appreciate the work that you're doing. You bring such a diverse group of people into your podcasts, covering all sorts of occupations, all sorts of backgrounds, all sorts of walks of life. And so I want to thank you for the work that you're doing.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. I really do appreciate that. If you enjoy this podcast, make sure you subscribe so you never miss any of our future episodes. Rate and review Obehi podcast and share with your friends who might need it. I remain Obehi Ewafo. Thank you so much for listening, and talk to you in the next episode.